I was shocked to see my wife kiss her boss at the company party she just had, and for a moment, the packed room seemed to collapse around me. I'd only gone there out of curiosity, but I discovered the truth she'd been trying to hide. "Don't worry, the divorce is ready," was all I could say before leaving. She tried to justify herself later, but her lover made it clear it was nothing more than an end-of-day diversion. Alone and regretful, she stared at the emptiness of what she'd destroyed. I slowly rebuilt my life alongside a new love, someone who brought me peace, sincerity, and a love without cracks. When she came to me asking for forgiveness, I respectfully extended my hand. I forgave her, yes, but we never got back together, and that was what made her realize. I never thought that moment would become the turning point of my life. It was supposed to be just another night, just a moment of curiosity. I'd been invited to her company party, but I'd immediately refused. I didn't want to be thrust into an environment that was more hers than mine. But that night, something inside me felt uneasy. A strange discomfort, as if my body knew before my mind that something wasn't right. I put on the first dress shirt I could find and went. I entered the brightly lit room, full of unfamiliar faces, drunken laughter, clinking glasses, and low, artificial music. She was there. Laughing. Beautiful as ever. Only next to him. The two of them so close it hurt. I couldn't believe it. Until I saw it. His hand sliding naturally down her back. And she, accepting it like someone who's already grown accustomed to it. The kiss wasn't the hardest part. It was the look afterward. She looked at him with the intimacy of someone who's surrendered herself many times. And there, in that exact second, everything we'd built seemed to crumble as if it had never existed. I smiled on the outside. I approached calmly. She looked at me with a slight look of alarm, as if she knew she'd been caught. And I simply said, "Don't worry, the divorce is ready." She tried to follow me, to mumble something. But he was faster. He said, without remorse, "Calm down, we were just having fun." And she froze. As if she didn't even know it was just that. As if she'd fallen into her own trap. The feeling was a mixture of nausea and pity. Not for myself. For her. For having thrown away an entire life for someone who didn't even see her as essential. I spent weeks in silence. At first, I slept on the couch, then I went to the hotel, then to my sister's house. She called me. She texted me. She tried to explain the inexplicable. And every time I heard her voice, the more certain I became that love had died. Not in me immediately, but in him. In love. Love died of shame, of heartbreak. He couldn't resist what he saw at that party. And no one can undo that. What hurt the most was remembering the details. The Sunday afternoons in the park, the nights watching TV shows with our legs intertwined, the plans for children, the impromptu dinners in the kitchen while some forgotten playlist played. All of that was overtaken by an impulse, by an unresolved need, by childish vanity. How could someone betray not only trust, but history? Because that's what it was. She didn't just betray me. She betrayed who she was with me. She betrayed what we built, what we dreamed, what we endured together. That's dirtier than the kiss itself. One day, after the separation, I found an old letter inside a book she'd given me for our first wedding anniversary. The letter was mine. I'd written to her one random night, telling her how grateful I was to have her by my side. I talked about how she made me feel safe, loved, whole. I was talking about how I believed we could overcome anything if we stayed together. The letter had a slightly crooked signature, like all my others. And it was there, between the pages of a book about love and forgiveness. She'd never read it. The letter was closed, untouched, as if it had been forgotten before it was even opened. When I found it, I cried. Not because I still loved her. But because I realized that, perhaps, from the beginning, she never read everything I felt. Perhaps, in her eagerness to be loved by others, she never realized the depth of the love she already had. Today I can talk about it calmly, but for a long time, anger and pride suffocated me. People said, "You'll get over it, you'll find someone better," as if love were a commodity that can be exchanged. But what no one understands is that when true love is hurt, it's not just about replacement. It's about healing something that's broken inside. It's about walking with a hole where there used to be a home. It's about learning to trust again, not only in the other person, but in yourself. And that doesn't happen overnight. She came to me some time later. She was different. Thinner, quieter, with a look that searched for something that no longer existed. She asked for forgiveness. She didn't ask me back, not with words. But her gaze begged for a second chance. And I, who previously thought I would enjoy seeing her like this, felt nothing but compassion. I didn't want to see her destroyed. I just wanted her to understand what she had done. I told her I forgave her. And she cried. She cried like someone who realizes that forgiveness is sometimes the end, not the beginning. Today, I found someone. A woman who arrived unhurriedly, without exaggerated promises. She came with truth. With silence where I needed peace. With listening where I only heard judgment. And little by little, she rebuilt me with small gestures. With hot tea at the end of the day. With silly messages in the morning. With affection in her eyes and firmness in her words. A love without cracks. A love that didn't need lies to survive. That didn't compete with my past, but knew how to walk with me into the future. It's ironic how everything changes. How time transforms pain into learning, loss into liberation. But sometimes I find myself staring into space, wondering what would have been if she had read that letter. If she had stopped to see that the love she sought from her boss was always at home. If she had realized that the sparkle in her eyes reflected how much I loved her, and not how much she was desired by others. Now she lives between regret and memory. I don't know if she's found someone else. I don't know if she still thinks of me as the one who lost or the one who destroyed. But I know that every time she closes her eyes, she'll remember that kiss at the party. And my words. And the way I left without looking back. Because when love dies, it's not with shouting. It's with a silence that weighs more than any fight. It's with a firm look saying, "Don't worry, the divorce is ready." But what she doesn't know is that the story didn't end there. What she doesn't know, is what I found inside that forgotten letter. Because there, among words she never read, was her last chance to not lose me. And it's precisely because of that letter that everything changed. Because of that letter, and something she never expected to find later. Something that will show that the biggest regret was yet to come. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize or support any type of betrayal. All the stories told are fictional, but they carry deep emotional truths, with the clear aim of showing how betrayal destroys lives, corrodes homes and kills true loves. Get ready, because what you're about to hear is strong, realistic and will move you. Take a deep breath, the story begins now. Lucas was never the loud type. He was a man of subtle gestures, deep gaze, and measured words. He always knew how to listen attentively and love gently. He had a way of making people feel safe around him, as if, being with him, the outside world became less harsh. With a degree in engineering, he worked as a structural design consultant and, although he didn't consider himself brilliant, he was recognized for his ethics, consistency, and the calm with which he resolved even the most tense situations. He lived a simple life, surrounded by books and memories, and it was precisely in this serene daily life that he met Anna. Anna, on the other hand, was full of words. Communicative, passionate about ideas, and driven by energy. She worked in the marketing department of a multinational company and was always involved in something new, be it a course, a trip, or a side project. She was spontaneous, funny, and intense, and it was this intensity that attracted Lucas from the very first moment. The encounter happened on a random late afternoon, over coffee with mutual friends. Anna arrived late, out of breath, laughing loudly, with a bag in her hands and her hair still damp from a hasty shower. Lucas had been there for over half an hour, silent, listening to the conversation flow. But when she entered, the atmosphere changed. She had a presence that demanded space. She sat next to him, apologized for the mess, and within minutes was telling stories as if they'd known each other for years. He laughed leisurely. She noticed. And that was how it all began. It wasn't love at first sight, but there was a silent recognition. As if each carried a piece that fit perfectly with the other. Their relationship quickly blossomed. Anna said she'd never felt so at peace in a relationship. Lucas, in turn, found himself feeling lighter, freer with her. She was creative chaos, and he was solid structure. They found balance. They shared lazy Sundays, short trips, and long-term plans. They built a life within themselves that seemed to be happening right, without rushing, without illusions. When they decided to get married, there was no formal proposal. Just a conversation in the kitchen while she chopped vegetables and he washed the dishes. "What if we made it official?" she asked, smiling. He looked at her and simply replied, "Yes." The wedding was simple, beautiful, surrounded by friends and family. A small hall, light flowers, a playlist hand-picked by her, and handwritten vows. Lucas cried as he read his. Anna laughed as she wiped his tears with her fingers. The couple's routine developed naturally. They lived in a spacious apartment with a balcony, near the park where they used to walk on Saturday mornings. She brought in too many plants, he hung paintings on the walls that were too straight. She talked about ideas she had before bed, he fell asleep mid-sentence. And this became a joke at breakfast the next morning. She complained that he forgot dates, he laughed, saying he only needed to remember the most important date, the day she came into his life. He teased her that she was a terrible driver, she countered by saying he was terrible at giving gifts. And amidst these small, everyday battles, reigned a love that seemed invincible. Anna was recognized at work, promoted frequently, surrounded by colleagues who admired her leadership skills and creativity. Lucas admired her too. He made a point of being present at her achievements, always with discreet flowers, messages of pride, or just a look that said it all. She, in turn, was proud of his solidity. The way he approached life with firmness, but without rigidity. They were good for each other. Or at least that was the case for a long time. That phase when they saw each other as accomplices in a project called Life Together. But time, it doesn't just pass, it tests. Little by little, their schedules began to clash. She would leave work late, citing urgent deadlines and endless meetings. Initially, he didn't mind. He knew her dedication. But as the months passed, he began to frequently dine alone, watch TV shows alone, and go to sleep before she arrived. Still, when she walked in the door, he smiled. He asked how her day was, offered tea, and hugged her. She, more often than not, said she was too tired to talk. And conversation became the exception. He noticed her absences but tried not to press her. He thought maybe it was just a difficult phase, that it would pass like the others had. Anna, however, seemed increasingly distant, even when he was present. Still, he stood his ground. He started making dinners when he knew she'd be home late. He started leaving notes around the house. A post-it note on the mirror saying, "You're amazing," a message on the kitchen cabinet saying, "We're still us, remember?" But the notes were ignored. Or forgotten. The business trips began. At first brief, then more frequent. She didn't like to give details, saying it was all too rushed, that she couldn't tell him everything. Lucas pretended to believe her, but there was a silent unease growing inside him. It wasn't jealousy. It was absence. It was emptiness. It was the fact that she no longer included him in things. At times like these, he tried to return to his old habits. He'd schedule dinners, try to convince her to take a weekend just for the two of them, away from the hustle and bustle. She'd sometimes agree, but her mind was always elsewhere. She'd answer her phone during dinner, reply to messages while he talked. And when he mentioned it, she'd tell him he was overreacting. That it was just a rough patch at work. That everything would get back to normal. But normal seemed ever more distant. He kept trying. Because he believed in the foundation they'd built. Because he still remembered the woman he'd fallen in love with. Because he still saw, occasionally, her sparkle in small gestures. But it wasn't enough anymore. One day, returning home early from work, he found her sitting on the couch with her face in her hands. She was crying silently. When he approached, she quickly wiped away her tears and said it was just fatigue. He wanted to insist, but he respected her space. That night, they slept in each other's arms, like they hadn't done in a long time. He thought that gesture meant something. He thought maybe it was the beginning of a reconnection. That they might meet again somewhere down the road. The next day, however, she left the house without even saying good morning. And he stayed there, his pillow still smelling of her, trying to understand what had happened. Lucas began to pay more attention to the silences. The small details. The way she avoided eye contact, the way she quickly changed the subject, the way she spent more time in the shower, on her cell phone, on the balcony. He tried not to jump to conclusions, but his heart seemed to know more than his mind allowed him to admit. He began to question where he had gone wrong. What he had failed to do. He wondered if he was being too little, if the routine had erased him, if he had stopped being the man she had fallen in love with. And he blamed himself for it. Still, he didn't confront her. Because, deep down, he still had hope. He believed the woman he had chosen to share his life with was simply tired. Overwhelmed. And not someone capable of lying. Even in the moments of greatest distance, there was a stubborn will within him to protect what they had built. Because love, when it's true, doesn't give up easily. It endures. It fights until its last breath. And Lucas was willing to fight. For her. For them. But he didn't know, yet, that some wars are already lost before they even begin. And that, no matter how hard one tries, some loves don't survive the slow erosion of contempt, omission, and lies disguised as excuses. Anna seemed to carry a weight she wouldn't share. A secret that grew between them like an invisible wall. And Lucas, even without understanding, could already feel the impact of this wall being erected right in the middle of the living room. But their story doesn't end in sadness. Or in suspicion. Because what was about to be revealed wasn't just a breach of trust. It was a breaking point. A moment so definitive it would make everything before seem distant. And everything after, irreversible. What Lucas didn't yet know was that the love he defended with such faith was already being torn apart by something he never imagined. And that, very soon, the truth would knock on his door, with enough force to change everything. Anna began to change almost imperceptibly, like someone moving away from a fire for fear of getting burned, but still pretending to be cold. Lucas couldn't pinpoint the exact day he felt she was no longer completely his, but he clearly remembered the feeling of emptiness that settled over the house like a cold breeze, the kind that seeps through cracks that once seemed sealed. She left earlier, returned later, and the eyes that once sought his urgently now avoided direct contact, as if knowing that hiding was safer than confronting. The routine between them continued, but emptied. Conversations were brief, touches sporadic, and apologies increasingly automatic. She said she was swamped with commitments, that the new projects demanded her complete dedication, that this was a decisive moment in her career, and that all she needed was understanding. And Lucas, though confused, offered exactly that. Understanding. He believed that love was also about knowing how to wait. On one of the few nights he managed to get home early from work, Lucas arrived with 2 glasses of wine and a box of pasta from her favorite restaurant. He lit some candles, put on her favorite playlist, and waited. When Anna arrived, she seemed surprised, but not exactly touched. She said she was tired, had already grabbed a quick bite to eat at work, and needed to shower. He insisted they sit together, even if only for a few minutes, but she refused. The wine was half finished, the food grew cold, and he stared at the candle flame as if trying to figure out exactly when their love had begun to fade. Still, he didn't give up. He started texting her throughout the day, asking if everything was okay, saying he missed them both, proposing short trips, weekends away. Anna always had an excuse, a legitimate reason, and Lucas tried to convince himself it was just a bad phase. And, silently, he kept everything to himself, believing that patience would be enough to save what they had. One Sunday morning, while organizing some papers in his office drawer, Lucas found a small gold earring, the kind Anna usually wore when they went out for more formal dinners. It was hidden among papers and pens, as if it had been dropped in a hurry. Picking it up, he felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't the earring itself. It was the fact that she hadn't missed it, hadn't looked for it, hadn't mentioned it. This spoke of more than forgetfulness, it spoke of disconnection. He returned the earring to her vanity without a word. And, for the first time in a long time, he began to observe with new eyes. He began to notice the prolonged silences, the laughter on her cell phone while she said she was in meetings, the absences on previously symbolic dates, the different scents on her clothes, the glances that flitted away in guilt. It was like putting together a puzzle without wanting to see the whole picture. Their conversations became shorter, more practical. They talked about bills, appointments, domestic problems. Affection gave way to polite cordiality, as if they were two colleagues sharing the same roof. When Lucas tried to ask directly if anything had changed, Anna responded irritably, saying she was suffocating, that he seemed suspicious of everything, and that she already had enough problems at work to deal with his insecurities at home. That silenced him. But it didn't convince him. Because the truth, even when unspoken, screams in small gestures. From that day on, he began to observe even more, not with jealousy, but with pain. The pain of someone who realizes they're being left behind but still doesn't know why. One night, Anna left her cell phone on the kitchen table. She was in the shower, and it vibrated 3 times in a row. Lucas looked at it, hesitated, but didn't touch it. He wasn't the invasive type, never had been. He trusted her. Or at least, he had until then. When she returned, she noticed his gaze and, in a quick gesture, grabbed the phone and put it in her coat pocket. She said it was just a friend from work talking about a project problem. He pretended to believe her. But he no longer did. It was like living inside a bubble about to burst. And yet, he remained there, looking at her as if trying to find traces of the woman who once told him he was her home. As the days passed, the signs became more obvious. Anna began avoiding his touch. She bounced sideways on the bed. He disguised his glances when they were in public. And he began leaving at odd hours, claiming he needed to meet with the team after hours, that deadlines were tight, that the client required constant updates. Lucas, even with his heart in pieces, tried to maintain his composure. He told himself there was still no proof. That it could be true. That maybe she was just really tired. But his instincts told him otherwise. And the pain of not knowing was, in itself, a punishment. Doubt is a wound that never heals. Then, one Friday night, a mutual friend texted him asking if he'd be at the company party where Anna worked. Lucas was surprised. "I didn't know there was a party. I hadn't been invited." But he replied that he might stop by. The friend, unaware, revealed that all the spouses had been invited, except him. This set off the final alarm bell. He didn't respond. He put on a dress shirt and dark shoes and went. He drove in silence, his heart pounding and his mind trying to prepare for anything. When he arrived, the place was crowded, with low music, warm lights, and unfamiliar faces. He passed through the guests as if walking through a minefield. He didn't see her right away. But when he did, he knew he'd arrived too late. She stood beside a tall, confident-looking man with an easy smile and a possessive touch. They laughed, talking too closely to be mere colleagues. And then it happened. Unaware she was being watched, Anna kissed him. A quick but intimate kiss. Full of familiarity. Lucas froze. The entire room seemed to collapse around him. The sound, the lights, the voices, everything became muffled, distant, as if he had been ripped from his own body. He walked toward her with slow steps. She saw him and paled. He approached, looked into her eyes, and said firmly, "Don't worry, the divorce is final." There was no shouting, no scenes. Just the delivery of a sentence that needed no further words. The other man tried to say something, but Lucas didn't hear. He was already leaving. His heart ached, not with anger, but with profound sadness. Mourning something that had been destroyed without warning. In the car, he took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and let the tears flow. He wasn't crying for her, he was crying for everything he believed to be eternal. He was crying for the wasted love, for the unappreciated commitment, for the sleepless nights spent trying to save a castle that was already in ruins. When he got home, he sat on the couch and stayed there for hours, staring into space. The next day, he packed some bags and left. He didn't say where he was going. He just knew he needed to get away from everything he once called home. Anna called repeatedly. She texted, tried to justify herself, saying she was confused, that she didn't want to hurt him, that everything had happened too quickly. But he didn't answer. He couldn't. Because there was nothing more to explain. The betrayal wasn't just the kiss. It was the gradual abandonment. The lack of presence. The lie disguised as exhaustion. It was the fact that she'd chosen another path without even looking back. And yet, something inside Lucas still hurt more than he'd imagined. Because, even after everything, there was a part of him that still tried to understand. That wanted to know where he'd lost his way. What he didn't yet know was that the worst was yet to come. That among the old papers, among the remnants of their experiences, lay a forgotten truth. Something that would change everything. A discovery capable of rewriting pain and transforming regret into despair. Because love, when wounded, bleeds. But when carelessly betrayed, it leaves traces, and secrets. Lucas had left the apartment where he lived with Anna almost 2 weeks ago. He didn't say where he was going, nor did he leave a message. He simply gathered what he needed and departed with the calm of someone who, deep down, was being ripped from himself. The following days were silent, slow, and filled with unanswered questions. He stayed for a while at his sister's house, and she respected his space without asking too many questions. He avoided social media, didn't read messages, and didn't answer calls. He was tired of explanations, justifications, and attempts at persuasion. He was exhausted by the pain. All I needed at that moment was distance. And silence. It was as if only time could detoxify the love that had rotted. On a cold, cloudy morning, unable to sleep, Lucas decided to go through some boxes he'd brought with him. They were old things, kept since the beginning of their marriage. Photographs, notes, loose notes, anniversary cards, and books with handwritten dedications. It made him ache, but at the same time, there was a part of him that needed to go through those memories like someone allowing themselves a final goodbye. Amidst an aged copy of a novel Anna had given him for their first wedding anniversary, an envelope fell to the floor. It was sealed. Her name was written on the front in her unmistakable, slightly crooked handwriting. Lucas frowned. He didn't remember writing that. He opened the envelope carefully, as if he were rummaging through a time capsule. The letter, dated 3 years ago, began with a sentence he felt he'd written at a time when everything still made sense. As I read, the emotion rose in waves. He spoke of how grateful he was to have her by his side, for her every gesture, for how effortlessly she completed him. He shared his fears, his vulnerabilities, but said, with all the sincerity he carried, that as long as she was with him, nothing in the world could shake him. At the end of the letter was a phrase he never forgot: "If you ever doubt my love, read this and remember that I was the one who chose you every day." When he finished reading, Lucas didn't cry. He just stared at the paper, a lump in his throat and a heavy soul. The letter was intact. She'd never read it. He remembered leaving it inside the book on purpose, hoping she'd stumble across it. But apparently, Anna never bothered to open that page. And in that moment, everything clicked. The absence, the disinterest, the coldness. It wasn't just physical betrayal. It was emotional abandonment. The neglect. The silent surrender of someone who'd stopped looking at her with love. The letter she'd never read was the cruelest symbol of what they'd become. The last straw for Lucas to understand there was no turning back. He decided he needed to talk to her. Not for reconciliation, but for closure. He needed to return that letter, needed to look her in the eyes and show her, one last time, what had been destroyed. He called, unsure if she would answer. Anna answered on the third ring. Her voice was low, cautious, as if expecting an attack. Lucas simply said he needed to see her. He didn't want to argue, he didn't want to fight. He just needed to talk. She agreed. They arranged to meet at the apartment where they had lived together. On the way, his heart felt heavy, but at peace. There was no more passion. Only a deep need to close that cycle with dignity. When he arrived, Anna was already there. She was dressed simply, her face bare, her hair tied up haphazardly. She seemed smaller. Not physically, but emotionally. There was a heaviness in her eyes that Lucas had never seen before. He entered without saying anything. He walked into the living room, sat on the sofa, and placed the letter on the table. She stared at the envelope as if it were a bomb about to explode. Lucas said, in a firm voice, that he had found it by chance. He explained that the letter had been written at a key moment in their marriage, and that he had purposely left it in that book because he thought she would understand. Anna took the envelope, opened it slowly, read it in silence, and when she finished, she couldn't speak. Her eyes were full, but not with immediate tears. It was a suppressed pain, a cry stuck in her throat. Finally, she spoke. She said she hadn't known the letter existed. That she'd never opened the book. That she now understood that perhaps much had been lost between them before she even realized it. Lucas replied that he hadn't expected her to apologize for not reading it, but that it showed how far apart they were. He said the betrayal didn't begin with the kiss, but long before, when she stopped seeing him. Anna tried to argue, but he held up his hand, urging her to calm down. He said he wasn't there to argue right and wrong, but to show how much that omission hurt. And it was at that moment that Anna broke down. She said she was never able to handle the pure love he offered. That at times she felt suffocated because she couldn't reciprocate with the same intensity. That she tried to fill her own emptiness with distractions, and that, along the way, she lost herself. She said the man she became involved with at work wasn't someone she loved, but someone who validated a side of her that she didn't respect. And that's why she fell. Because she mistook vanity for affection. Crying, Anna confessed that after the separation, she returned to the apartment many times, trying to find something that would reconnect her to the truth, but all she found were absences. She said she slept on the couch, hugging one of his shirts, that she rummaged through books looking for answers, and that there, between the pages of an old book, she found a second letter she'd never had the courage to deliver. She got up, went to her bedroom, and returned with a white envelope, slightly yellowed at the edges. He handed it to Lucas with trembling hands. He opened it. The letter was short. Anna said she had cheated, yes, but not just physically. That she had betrayed the essence of both of them. That she had ignored the value of the man who had been by her side through thick and thin. But what came next was the hardest. She confessed she found his letter at the back of her book 3 days after her kiss with her coworker. That she read it and fell apart. That she tried to stop him from finding out, but it was too late. She said that, after reading it, she spent an entire night sitting on the bedroom floor, crying, with the letter on her lap, and that it was there that she realized she had lost something that would never return. That the kiss had been a mistake, but what hurt was not having seen the love before destroying it. Lucas remained silent. He stared at the words with a mixture of anger and compassion. The letter was dated before the separation. She knew it. And yet, she didn't speak. He stood, put the 2 letters in his pocket, and said that everything made sense now. That what hurt him wasn't just the act, but the conscious choice not to try to make amends when there was still time. Anna grabbed his arm, desperate. She said she regretted it, that she lives tormented by the memories, that she would give anything to go back. She begged him to forgive not only the mistake, but the omission. Lucas looked into her eyes for a long time. There was a deep sadness there, but also a peace. He said forgiveness was necessary, but that forgiveness didn't mean return. He said she needed to understand that some losses are permanent. That love, when left untended, dies. He said he wished she could find herself again, that she could heal her own pain, but that their time was over. Anna wept, unable to speak. Lucas approached, rested his forehead against hers for a few seconds, and simply said, "If you had read that letter at the right time, maybe we would still be together." And then he left. Outside, the sky was beginning to darken. A light breeze blew across his face. He felt lighter, as if he had finally healed a long open wound. He walked without looking back. And in that moment, something new opened within him, not a longing, but a freedom. Because now, he knew. The pain that had destroyed him was also the bridge that freed him. And what would come next, would finally be his. Lucas didn't rush out of the building. He didn't run away, nor did he hesitate. He walked to his car, feeling the weight of everything he'd carried for so long finally begin to lift from his shoulders. It wasn't relief, not yet. It was just the absence of the constant pain, the one that had lived with him for months like a silent pang in the back of his chest. Sitting behind the wheel, the letters in his pocket like 2 silent witnesses to a broken story, he let the engine idle, unsure of where he was going. The apartment where they lived was no longer theirs. His sister's house was a refuge, but not a home. He needed air. So he just drove. He left the city, continued down the road until night fell on the windshield and the solitude of the road became complicit in his thoughts. He spent that night in a hostel on the outskirts, one of those places that seems frozen in time, with firm mattresses and sheets that smelled of old clothes. He didn't sleep much. Anna's letter spun in his head like a song that wouldn't go away. Not because he still loved her, but because he finally understood that she knew, she read, she understood, but he chose to remain silent. That was the part one couldn't digest. Betrayal was hurtful, but omission was poisonous. She had read her open heart on paper right after giving herself to another man, and yet she chose silence. He wondered if she had felt guilt or simply fear of facing what she had done. There was no way of knowing, and it no longer mattered. Because the only thing he knew now was that this chapter of his life had an end. And I needed to keep writing the next ones. He returned to the city 2 days later. He didn't contact Anna. He didn't respond to her messages. He had decided to close that circle with the same dignity with which he had opened it, calmly, without scandal, without turning the pain into a spectacle. Upon returning, he dedicated himself to putting his life in order. He got a new apartment, smaller, more his own. He began taking walks every day, resumed reading, going to the gym, and having dinners with friends. There were days when melancholy knocked on his door, of course it did, but he didn't stay long. It was as if an occasional visitor came to remind him of what was gone. And that had its beauty, too. A few weeks later, while organizing a bookshelf at the neighborhood bookstore he'd always frequented, he met someone who would change the course of his story without him even knowing it. Julia was an editor and, like him, had gone looking for something without knowing exactly what. They exchanged a few comments about books, then a smile, then a conversation that lasted longer than planned. Nothing forced. Nothing intense. Simple. Real. Julia had a calm gaze, the kind that doesn't invade you, but holds you. Her voice was soft, but not fragile. There was a calm firmness in it that Lucas hadn't encountered in a long time. They said goodbye with a "see you later" that, without anyone noticing, already had the flavor of a reunion. The following days brought texts, coffees, and aimless walks. They weren't talking about the past. Not because they avoided it, but because they allowed themselves to get to know each other through the present. Julia didn't ask more than Lucas was willing to tell, and he didn't force himself to reveal more than the moment allowed. There was room to breathe. And that, for Lucas, was new. Over time, they began to share more, laughter in the kitchen, movie nights, comfortable silences. It wasn't an explosive love. It was one built like a solid house, brick by brick, unhurriedly, but with purpose. One afternoon, while organizing books in her new apartment, Julia found Anna's letter tucked between the pages of a notebook. Lucas tensed for a moment, but she didn't ask. He simply set it aside, as if understanding there were things that belonged in another story. Hours later, while they were drinking tea on the couch, Lucas decided to tell her. Not in detail, not with drama. Just the truth. Julia listened to him in silence. And when he finished, he told her there was nothing to explain. That the scars spoke for themselves. That she wasn't there to replace anything, but to build something new. Lucas felt his heart drop inside him. For the first time in a long time, he felt completely seen. And accepted. Months passed. Life went on. Love grew. But the past, like all shadows, finds a way to return, even if briefly. Anna appeared again. Not with messages. Not with pleas. With a letter. One Julia found in the mailbox one rainy morning. It was addressed to Lucas. Julia didn't open it. She handed it to him silently, with a look that said, "Do what you must." Lucas took 2 days to open it. Not out of fear, but out of self-respect. When he finally did, he found words he hadn't expected. Anna didn't ask for forgiveness. Nor was she seeking reconciliation. The letter was a kind of confession. She said that, after the separation, she tried to rebuild her life, but nothing worked. Not for lack of opportunities, but because everything compared to what I had with him. He said he lived with the feeling of having made the worst mistake of his life. That she had read his letter many times, and that with each reading, she felt a part of her soul shatter. He said he still kept the book where he found it, as if it were a relic of what was. But the most shocking part came at the end. Losing you made me understand that love isn't found, it's built. And I destroyed ours out of cowardice. I don't expect anything. I just wanted you to know that, in my world, you still live. Even if you're gone. Lucas closed the letter with firm hands. She didn't cry. He didn't feel anger. Only a silent compassion. Anna had understood, belatedly, what he tried to show her so many times. And that, despite her sadness, it no longer belonged to her. This was a burden she alone had to carry now. He no longer lived there. He had chosen another path. One where there were no lies, no excuses, no buried secrets. One where love needed no proof, because it was demonstrated every day with presence, with care, with truth. That night, Julia hugged him from behind as he stared out the window. He said nothing. He didn't ask. And in that shared silence, Lucas knew he'd come to the right place. I was no longer looking for answers, because I'd already understood that some wounds heal not with words, but with actions. That forgiveness is a personal act, not a reconciliation. And that there are loves that leave a mark, but don't define. Anna didn't write again. He didn't show up again. Lucas kept her last letter in a box, along with his own. Not as a reminder of pain, but as a reminder that even the most beautiful stories can be undone if left unattended. And that sometimes, the hardest lesson is losing the one you loved most to finally find yourself. In the end, the betrayal wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of another. One where love came unmasked. Where it was possible to rebuild without resentment. And where, finally, Lucas loved again. Not like before. But better. More aware. Higher. Freer. From the moment Lucas finished reading the last letter, something inside him changed definitively. It wasn't an abrupt turn, but a silent transition, as if each word he read had carefully dismantled the last remnants of the past he still carried on his shoulders. That letter didn't surprise him for the confessions or the evident pain between the lines, but for the certainty that now, even given everything they had been through, he no longer wanted to go back. For the first time, he could look back with compassion rather than longing. The wound no longer bled, though it was still tender to the touch. But there was a point of no return, and he had crossed it. That night was particularly silent. Julia watched him from a distance, not with unease, but with the patience that only those who love maturely can offer. There was a depth to the way she respected Lucas's space, how she allowed him to navigate his pain without trying to interfere. They lay side by side, and although they didn't talk much, the gesture of intertwining their hands before falling asleep said more than any explanation could offer. It was the kind of love that didn't need to be expressed often, because it was felt in every detail. In the days that followed, Lucas returned to work with a new disposition. It wasn't euphoria. It was peace. A discreet tranquility, like someone finally home after a long, exhausting trip. He returned to his forgotten passions, like photography, and started attending a book group on Saturdays, something that was part of a list of small things he'd unwittingly abandoned during the strain of his previous relationship. He wasn't seeking distraction, but connection with who he truly was. His love for Anna, now that he saw it clearly, had been as intense as it was one-sided lately. He'd given more than he'd received, endured more than he should have, and now he understood that true love requires emotional reciprocity, not just physical presence or legal ties. Julia was also beginning to occupy an increasingly important space in his routine. Not out of necessity, but by choice. Being with her was like taking a deep breath after years of holding it. She didn't demand justifications, didn't demand quick fixes, didn't compare. On the contrary, she welcomed him. There was something about her that gave Lucas permission to be vulnerable without shame. It was as if she was constantly telling him, without words, that he didn't have to be strong all the time, that it was okay to have scars. And with that, Lucas slowly rebuilt himself, unhurriedly, consciously. One day, while organizing a new space in his home to store old photo albums and other items with sentimental value, Lucas came across the wedding ring he had saved months ago. He held it between his fingers for a few minutes, staring at that small object that carried so much symbolic weight. The ring no longer hurt. It wasn't a reminder of loss, but a memory of who he had been. Of a chapter closed, albeit filled with pages written in pain. He considered returning the ring to Anna, but soon realized she probably didn't need it, or perhaps even want it. He put it away again, not as a reminder of suffering, but as part of a story that had helped him grow. Anna, for her part, remained physically absent, but occasionally she would resurface in the form of a memory, or in brief mentions of mutual friends. Lucas didn't block her from anything, not out of pride or a desire to keep a door ajar, but because he knew that hiding the past wouldn't erase it. He was at peace with the fact that she knew what she had lost. And that she would live with it. But there was one specific day, an ordinary afternoon, when Julia received a call that would change the balance of the following days. It was Anna. The call wasn't long, but it was enough to provoke a silent discomfort. She didn't call to argue, nor to interfere in their relationship. She simply asked to speak with Lucas in person one last time. She said she needed closure. Julia, with the maturity she always displayed, calmly told Lucas. She said she wasn't opposed to the meeting, but that he needed to be sure it wouldn't lead him back to pain he had already overcome. He thanked her and remained silent for several minutes, absorbing the weight of that choice. The dilemma Lucas faced was profound. It wasn't about whether or not to still love. It was about self-respect, about the limits of empathy. He had already closed that chapter, but he knew that, for Anna, there might be things still unsaid. He knew he had every right to refuse, but he also understood the value of allowing the other one final gesture of redemption. It was a moral dilemma, to reach out to someone who had hurt him, not out of hope, but out of compassion. He spent that night thinking. He spoke frankly to Julia, exposing his fears, and found in her not jealousy or insecurity, but understanding. She told him she trusted him, and that if it was something he felt he needed to do, he should go. 2 days later, he arranged to meet Anna. He chose a discreet cafe in a remote neighborhood, where they were unlikely to encounter acquaintances. He arrived 10 minutes early and sat by the window. Anna arrived punctually, without makeup, with her hair tied in a low bun and wearing a dark coat. She was visibly worn, but not frail. There was a heaviness in her eyes that came not from fatigue, but from unresolved guilt. She sat across from him, and for a few seconds neither of them said anything. Then, in a firm voice, she thanked him for agreeing to meet her. She said she didn't expect reconciliation, that she didn't want to touch open wounds, but that she needed, from the depths of her soul, to express something she hadn't yet been able to say. Anna said that, after the separation, she tried to move on with her life as if nothing had happened. She went out, traveled, met other people. But no connection lasted. Everything felt empty. She said that for a long time she tried to convince herself that the mistake had been mutual, that they had both lost each other. But deep down, she knew that the choice to cheat was entirely hers, and that the silence after the discovery was even crueler. She confessed that she read his letter dozens of times after that kiss, and that each time she read it, it was as if something inside her broke again. She said she became obsessed with recovering what she had destroyed, but that, upon realizing he had already rebuilt his life with another woman, she felt a mixture of pain and relief. Because, deep down, she knew he deserved someone who would see him whole, and she wasn't able to. Lucas listened to her attentively, without interrupting. He felt no anger. He felt a kind of compassionate sadness, like someone watching a familiar movie, knowing the ending and accepting that nothing could be done to change it. When she finished, he thanked her for her honesty. He said that, yes, it was difficult, that there were nights when he thought he would never trust anyone again. But that, in the midst of it all, he also found himself. He said he held no grudges, but that love, when betrayed and set aside, could not endure. That she had lost not just a man, but a partner willing to face everything by her side, and that now, it was too late. Anna smiled sadly. She said she expected nothing less from him. That this greatness of character was precisely what hurt the most to lose. They said goodbye with a restrained hug, full of everything that could never be. And as she walked away down the damp street, Lucas didn't feel like calling her back. He felt only the closing of a cycle, true, mature, and necessary. He returned home and found Julia reading in the living room. She looked up, and he simply said, "Everything's okay now." She smiled, hugged him, and they continued the evening like so many others, simple, serene, real. Now, the past no longer took up so much space. And the future finally had room to grow. Because when you choose consciously, peace is the greatest gift you can have. And for Lucas, peace had stopped being a quest and had become his new home. After that last encounter, Lucas realized that the line separating him from the past had finally been crossed without regret. The conversation with Anna, however emotionally intense, didn't rekindle anything, neither hurt, nor anger, nor any kind of hidden desire for a fresh start. On the contrary, it brought a clarity that only mature silence and the truth spoken without manipulation could generate. It wasn't about a dramatic ending, it was about understanding that, in some stories, the end comes long before the final word. And Julia's presence in this new chapter was more than a relief, it was a reflection of the peace he had finally found within himself. She didn't compete with ghosts, didn't demand proof of affection, she simply walked alongside, adding value, without haste or pressure. And it was through this journey that Lucas began to recognize himself in his own journey, not as the victim of betrayal, but as someone who had the courage to be reborn from pain. A few weeks later, they decided to travel. Not to escape anything, but to celebrate what they were building. They chose a small coastal town with cobblestone streets, cafes hidden among colonial houses, and a sea that seemed to whisper gentle promises in the wind. The trip wasn't full of luxuries or sophisticated plans, but it did include long walks, cafes with lingering conversations, and shared silences that were worth more than fiery speeches about love. One of those nights, after a simple dinner by the sea, Julia asked if he had ever truly forgiven. Lucas took a moment to answer. He stared at the horizon for a few moments before saying yes, but that forgiveness hadn't been a noble gesture directed at Anna, it was a gift he'd given himself. Because carrying hurt was like keeping your house locked and living outside. And he wanted to live within himself again. That night, they made love with an intimacy only possible when two people are not only physically but also emotionally naked. There was an almost sacred respect between them, a conscious surrender, without empty promises, without fear of the future. Julia never pressured him to talk about what he'd experienced, but when he decided to open up, she listened with her eyes. And it was in one of these moments that Lucas revealed a detail he'd never told anyone, not even Anna. He said that, years before everything happened, he'd planned a surprise trip for the two of them, abroad, as a way of thanking her for everything they'd overcome together so far. He'd saved money, researched itineraries, even bought travel guides. But something in Anna was already distant, and he sensed it wasn't the right time. He put the plans in a folder, and there they stayed, until everything collapsed. Julia held his hand and said, with firm sweetness, that he no longer needed to keep plans for anyone, because now, they would create everything together, with transparency. Months passed. The relationship matured. Lucas returned to writing, something he'd done in college but had abandoned over time. Not technical texts, nor sad outbursts, he wrote about human encounters, about what remains when love is handled with care. Julia encouraged him without intruding. One afternoon, while showing one of his texts to an acquaintance in the publishing industry, he was invited to participate in an anthology about new beginnings. And he accepted. Not to prove anything, but as a way to record what he'd experienced, as if telling his story would also transform it into something greater than the pain it caused. It was during this rebuilding phase that he received another message from Anna. This time, brief. It simply said that she had read one of the published texts and recognized pieces of their story there. I would appreciate it, not because I was mentioned, but because I had been transformed into a learning experience. Lucas didn't respond. Not out of indifference, but because he felt that her cycle was now also completely over. The shadow of what they had been no longer loomed over his choices. He no longer needed to explain or justify. Silence is sometimes the most honest seal one can place on something that was once important but is no longer. Julia accompanied him through everything, not as a savior, but as a woman who had chosen to love someone with a past, a history, and scars. They had disagreements, of course. Not everything was perfect. But conflicts were resolved maturely, without games, without manipulation. Lucas had learned to recognize the signs of emotional misalignment that, in the past, he had ignored. And now, faced with any sign of disconnection, he talked, opened up, faced up to it, not out of fear of loss, but out of a desire to maintain it. And Julia did the same. They were two adults willing to work for the bond they built every day. One Saturday morning, they decided to visit a bookstore hosting an independent authors fair. Between book launches and signings, Lucas reconnected with faces from the past, college classmates, acquaintances from the time when he still believed love was insulated against mistakes. One of them invited him for coffee and, between conversations about his professional and personal life, asked how he'd managed to overcome everything so well. Lucas didn't give a ready answer. He said it wasn't quick, nor easy. There were sleepless nights, heavy anguish, and a constant feeling of failure. But at some point, he understood that a love that ends doesn't erase what was true. And that moving on isn't about forgetting, but choosing to live more consciously. His friend, visibly touched, was silent for a few seconds before saying he was also going through a difficult breakup. And for the first time in a long time, Lucas felt his pain had become a bridge, not a wall. On the way home, he told Julia about the conversation. She listened attentively and then said something he would never forget. She said that some people are lucky enough to find love more than once, but few learn from their first love to make the second even more beautiful. Lucas smiled, kissed her hand, and realized it was true. He wasn't there despite what he'd experienced, he was there precisely because he had. Life went on, with its routines, its pauses, its surprises. But there was a new lightness to everything. Birthdays were now celebrated with depth, not formality. Conversations didn't shy away from difficult topics, but were imbued with empathy. Ordinary days had value. And the extraordinary lay in the details: breakfast in bed on no special day, the note left in the jacket pocket, the touch on the shoulder before falling asleep. Lucas never saw Anna again after that last coffee. But every now and then, passing places they used to frequent together, he remembered her. Not with pain, but with a kind of respect for what was. She was part of his story, and as much as she failed, she also taught him this. Betrayal destroyed a version of him that was no longer sufficient for today. But it also pushed him to a new place. A place where he now knew who he was. He knew what he wanted. He knew how to love, and most importantly, how to be loved in return. This awareness guided him firmly. Not as a shield against further disappointment, but as an internal compass. He knew that nothing was guaranteed, that even the best loves needed to be watered. But now, he was prepared. And more than that, he was willing. Because pain, when properly navigated, doesn't create bitterness. It creates clarity. And Lucas, finally, saw everything clearly. Life, the past, the present. And what was yet to come. Time continued its course as it always does, unconcerned with the marks it left on hearts, without stopping to soothe pain or prolong joy. And even though no day held any apparent meaning, every small gesture, every daily choice, every silence or spoken word formed the invisible fabric of the destiny of each of those three characters who, somehow, lost and found themselves within the same story. Lucas, now more whole, continued his path alongside Julia, with the firmness of someone who understood that true love doesn't need to scream to exist, that it reveals itself in consistency, in daily care, in the mutual decision to remain, even when emotions waver. They didn't become an idealized couple, but they became real to each other, and this, more than passionate promises, sustained the days with authenticity. It was on a winter night, wrapped around a blazing fireplace and hands intertwined on the sofa, that Lucas proposed to Julia, not with a grand production or spectacle, but with steady eyes and a simple question: do you want to continue building a life with me, day after day? Julia smiled, moved, and said yes, not because she needed him to be happy, but because she had chosen to be with him even after discovering her shadows. This love, now, was not just a reparation for the past, it was the seed of a future without fear. A few months later, the two celebrated their union in a low-key ceremony, surrounded by people who had witnessed not only Lucas's rebirth but also the power of a conscious new beginning. Among the guests were friends who had long seen the pain in his eyes and now witnessed the serenity in his smile. There were no fairy tale speeches or eternal promises at the celebration, but truth in every look, in every shared gesture, in every small exchange that said, "This time, it's different. This time, it's real." Lucas carried in his heart the certainty that he was no longer the same man who was betrayed and left behind, but someone who transformed pain into wisdom, grief into life. And Julia, in turn, carried the gift of loving without hurting, of caring without invading, of building without erasing the other's story. Anna, on the other side of the story, followed a much quieter path. After her last conversation with Lucas, she felt as if the ground had finally dropped from under her feet, not because she still loved him as before, but because she understood, with cruel clarity, that he no longer belonged in her life at all. She tried to fill her time with work, but found that long days and endless meetings no longer fulfilled her. She moved apartments, sold old objects, cut her hair short as if she could, with it, erase the previous versions of herself. But it wasn't the exterior that needed changing. It was within. She sought therapy, immersed herself in courses, in self-discovery books, tried to understand what inside her had allowed the ruin of something so beautiful. And, for the first time, she faced herself without the mask of pride. She discovered, with painful tears, that it wasn't just the mistake of betrayal that needed to be faced, but the root of her own insecurity, the constant search for external validation, the fear of being seen too much, touched too much, exposed too much. She understood that she had let Lucas escape not because he had stopped loving her, but because she herself had not known how to remain whole in the love he offered. A few years passed. Anna had other relationships, but none lasted. Not because they were bad, but because she was still learning to rebuild herself genuinely, without repeating old patterns, without sabotaging herself for feeling inadequate. One day, while walking through a local book fair, she saw Lucas's name prominently displayed on a stand. She stopped and picked up the copy. It was a collection of chronicles about new beginnings, and as she leafed through it, she found, among the pages, a text that spoke of unread letters, of loves that die in silence, of silent goodbyes. There, she read a piece of her own soul, beautifully and without hurt. She felt like crying, but she didn't. She simply closed the book, bought a copy, and left in silence. That night, she read the text again, now at home, and understood that, although they would never be us again, she had been important in shaping who he was now. And, somehow, that comforted her. Because, even though she made a mistake, even though she lost, she contributed to the blossoming of someone who deserved to be happy. The man with whom Anna cheated, Lucas, followed a very different path. After their separation, he and Anna never stayed together. He didn't even show any intention of anything serious. He was someone who thrived on the adrenaline of the moment, who fluctuated between relationships without ever going deeper. In the corporate world, he gradually lost credibility. The charm that once disguised his lack of ethics became his downfall. Colleagues began to avoid him, bosses became suspicious of his instability. There were no scandals, but a slow deflation. One day, he was coldly dismissed, without public explanation. He walked out the front door as if he understood he'd reached the end of a cycle he'd built on appearances. Since then, he's moved cities and tried to start over somewhere else. But he hasn't settled down. And, on nights when the silence weighed more heavily than the wine in the glass, perhaps he remembered that woman he kissed in the corner of a party, without imagining that that gesture would destroy so much more than a relationship, that it would tear away from someone much more than just a partner. It would tear away a piece of the life of a man who, even wounded, still had the greatness to move forward with dignity. And so, life went on. Each with their own truths, their losses, their lessons. Lucas and Julia built a home together where transparency was the rule, where mistakes weren't hidden but faced with maturity. They had a daughter, and when he held her for the first time, Lucas felt that all the broken pieces within him had reassembled to form something new, something that would never have existed had he not gone through what he had. He taught his daughter, from an early age, that love demands responsibility, that trust can't be improvised, and that the most valuable thing in a relationship is the ability to remain present, even when everything seems difficult. Julia, in turn, accompanied every step with gentleness and firmness, and together they built a future where it wasn't necessary to erase the past to live well. If you've made it this far, this story certainly touched you in some way. So comment below with your thoughts, what impacted you most, and if you've experienced something similar or know someone who has. Your opinion is crucial, and we want to hear from you. Also, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next impactful stories. Here, each narrative is an invitation to reflection, a mirror of real life, with mistakes, successes, pain, and new beginnings. And remember, betrayal isn't just an isolated act, it's a deep rift that hurts not only trust, but the very essence of love. It destroys homes, breaks promises, and erodes dignity. Those who betray don't just destroy the other person, they destroy themselves in the process. And that's why this channel does not support, justify or romanticize any type of betrayal. We tell stories to remind people that love needs to be nurtured, every day, with truth, loyalty, and presence. Because, in the end, those who choose to cheat may think they're gaining freedom, but what they really lose is the chance to experience a whole love. Until the next story.